We've got another member here, Aiden.
Mhm.
He's asking, do you find there to be any important negatives or benefits for the aggressive clip to zero methods? Are you familiar with what he's talking about? I'm
No.
assuming it's like he's talking about electronic style mixing.
Mm.
I'm thinking if I had to try to interpret what that is, since I'm not initiated, it would be like using a clipper to get the peaks as close to zero as possible. Maybe is that what you think that could mean? Clip to zero method. Let me see if I can run a Google search and see if
Yeah,
that's a
let's
specific thing.
ask Claude or something about what that is. I don't know. I don't know. I've never heard that term before, but
Here we go.
um,
It says a high loudness mixing technique that uses aggressive staged clipping on every track, bus, and group to reach max loudness by the master stage. That's kind of what I was thinking. I mean, remember that this is for a specific type of music. You know?
I mean, yeah, okay. But what was his question? Was there any negatives to that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question because then you can make the decisions based on that. So the question was, are there any important negatives or benefits for that aggressive workflow?
Well, I think there's only one reason you take that workflow, and it's because you want the benefit of maximum signal. And to use all of the digital range of a system is, I guess, to some extent exciting. I don't know how practical it is. I'm sure it generates a sound. I don't know what that sound is, so I can't really comment on them from an opinion based perspective, which is I'm trying to figure out like the objective way to answer this question. I mean, the danger is that you're going to distort. Anytime you push things into that level of compression, you're squaring off your waveforms to the point where they stop resembling the source, and you're manipulating them into something new. And so I guess the danger would be if that's not warranted or appropriate or is in some way off-putting, then you wouldn't want to do it. But I'm not trying to discredit the question, but I don't know entirely how to answer it without giving you know an uninformed opinion,
Yeah.
because I've just never mixed that way before. So I don't have anything to really report back from my experience. I would ask Aiden, like, what do you think the benefits are of mixing at a high level like that? I think generally speaking, I don't, because it brings up a noise floor and it distorts. I just don't work with instruments that benefit from that kind of a distortion, at least not all the way across the board. I will do that to a couple of instruments and blend it into what I'm doing for color, or sometimes for an effect. I'll do that, but I think it's not. I don't know. It may be a genre all in of itself, but you're breaking a lot of rules that other genres follow religiously. So it's kind of hard to answer that in a vacuum of some more context, or probably for me personal experience. And I apologize because I'm sure that's not the answer you were looking to get.
Well, Aiden is typing a response here. So it says,
Okay.
as I understand it, a key component of this mixing style is to avoid audible distortion at all levels. And let's take a step back for people
Mm.
watching. Like, you know, this idea of clipping and why are we associating distortion with clipping and making what would be maybe a sine wave into a square wave? Because everything can be distilled down into sine waves, and when you change the shape of a wave, it creates distortion inherently. It's like the same thing, two sides of the same coin, the shape of the waveform and the distortion,
Well,
you distorting the waveform.
there's two. Well, yeah. I mean, you're using the word twice in two different ways there, so we have to be careful about this. So, distortion as a noun is referring to uh, uh, an intentional or unintentional change of the fidelity of the signal, right? When we're so if distortion itself is like It's like smacking your reflection in the pond. For a moment you won't see your reflection, and there's elements of your reflection in there, but it's not you. And so in that case, that could be good if you don't want to see your own reflection. If you do want to see your own reflection, that would be bad, right? So intentionality as a part of distort. When we talk about distortion, we have to also be clear about what the intentionality is. And you cannot apply a compressor or a limiter. I'm just going to categorically say you cannot apply compression or limiting to a signal without getting some level of distortion. Is it an appropriate amount for the thing you're trying to get? That's a subjective choice you make, but it is not objectively true that compressing or limiting a signal results in zero distortion. And
Yeah,
when you're
when I'm reading this, I'm maybe inferring that it's the goal, the priority actually is to get it
mm,
louder. And if we're
mm,
going to turn it up louder, maybe the idea is if we cascade several stages of a little bit of clipping, is that going to give us a different result to achieve loudness with less distortion than if we just had no clipping at all until the end and we tried to do it all at the final stage?
yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
that's an angle that because I'm with you, Gabe. Like, if the goal is to avoid audible distortion, I would not reach for a clipper. But if the goal is to get it loud and you want to minimize the audible distortion that's caused in getting louder than the
Well,
system wants to let you do,
but that's
then
the
maybe
thing.
that
Like
is
I think that's the problem I have with it is that there are lots of loud mixes that don't measure loud, but they feel really loud. If you listen to like Rage Against the Machine, like that album is loud, but if you measure it, it's not as loud as a lot of other albums are. And in some ways, it sounds louder. And that's the difference between perceived loudness and actual measured loudness. And that's one of the problems I have with this approach is that the idea that something has to actually measure loud in order to sound or feel loud is a misconception. Um, Especially these days when most streaming sites are, asking for music at minus 14 lufs. Um, you don't need to get it that loud, but you still want to make it feel loud. And the Rage Against the Machine record feels loud at minus 14 lufs. So that has more to do with the way you're presenting sound over time and the clarity of the mix than it does with how close to zero you are. It's almost like because there's no sonic benefit to the negative space of your dynamic range above minus 48 dBFS. So just because you're operating way up at the top there doesn't mean your audio is any better than it was if it were like 6 or 12 dB lower than that. It sounds exactly the same. It's just quieter within the scale of the system, but it has no sonic characteristics that are different. And instead of focusing on just making everything go close to peak, if you instead focus on the length of those sounds and the intensity of those sounds and the timbre of those sounds, you can make mixes that sound and feel very loud, but they're not measuring near zero. So this is the thing that I think is maybe I'm this is where I'm having a hard time because in my experience, I know I can mix a track to feel loud, and it doesn't actually measure loud. And when you say zero being the ideal or near clipping is the ideal, I don't know. I can put a meter pretty close to clipping, and it doesn't feel very loud at all. In fact, it can feel small. The harder you compress stuff, the more compression builds up, the smaller the track will feel because there's the speakers just aren't able to move much because they're just in a constant state of push. And instead, I would prefer to build tracks that have complex harmonics that feel big from complex harmonic structure than just uber intense gain pressure. I don't know if that makes sense, Kyle. If I'm making sense here, but
it does make sense, and I think it's a more advanced topic. I think when you start thinking like what you were saying about if you have just pure headroom in the digital world, like if you had the same mix and it had peaks at -6 and then you turned up the peaks to -4, it's the same. It's just louder, you know. But if you try to turn it up and then you start to go, let's say you get to -0 and you want it to be even louder, you're going to have to start creating distortion in order to get the perceived loudness to go up further, right?
Well,
Or
I mean, I
what other
guess.
ways, actually, maybe you could talk about, Gabe, what are some other ways that you can enhance perceived loudness without actually just turning it up?
Well, look, I think what has to be said here is to say time out on the creation side, okay? Because it doesn't matter how loud your mix is. The playback system is what's going to make it loud to you. So if the goal is to listen to music really, really loud, you got to get a really powerful playback amplifier and some really big speakers, and then do the Maxell commercial thing and sit in your chair and have your hair blow in the breeze and stuff. I mean that's going to be loud. And in the days back in the day when I was a young whippersnapper, when you'd have records that had nothing on them. They were called silent grooves, and the whole deal, like among audiophiles, was you put your silent record on the record player and you drop the needle and you could get the amp to turn all the way up and you could barely hear the scratches and the pops. And that would be like the test to know like how quiet is your system, because noise floor mattered a lot. Now these days we don't have vinyl anymore. So well, actually it's making a comeback, but in digital, right? Or at least in most commercial playback systems, we don't have that same issue, but we do have the issue of you can turn things up as loud as you need it to be. I can make my car painfully loud while driving. Um, does that mean I have to mix my music that loud to get it to play back that loud? I mean, if people want to listen to music loud, they can turn up their amp. So I push back on the idea that it has to be mixed loud for people to listen to it loud. I don't think that makes sense. But I don't want to be myopic either and miss the point, right? Which is to say that is there a way? How do we work on? How do I? If you want to do this and you think that's a style and has a sound that you like, understand the sound that you're preferring, where it comes, excuse me, where it comes from. And it's coming from peaking, small amounts of peaking and flattening, squaring off of a waveform. That's auditive harmonic distortion. And there's lots of ways to get that. And you might even find plugins that can provide auditive harmonic distortion without clipping, right? There's a lot of clipper plugins that will do this. They just add that signal, that kind of distortion to your signal. And you don't have to get anywhere near zero clipping on your meter to get that sound. It's just happening within a plugin. Okay. If you want your mixes to sound big without actually being big, then it comes down to having lots of aggressive tone. So if you listen, for example, to the guitars in Rage Against the Machine, I'm going to just use that since I cited it. I'll continue to use it as an example. You really can hear in the guitars a breadth of harmonics that includes lots of lows, nice big lows, and some really screaming mids and some very piercing highs. But the vocal is still very clear, and the vocalist is singing loud, like with a loud voice. Almost all the time he's like yelling. And the guitars feel like they're yelling, and the drums feel like they're yelling, but they all feel like they're under control. And because they were all recorded very closely with close mics, with a very compressed and tight treatment of the room around them, they present as very big sounds. And then carving out the frequencies, so exactly the moment where the bass gives up its energy is right when the guitars take over, means that we get this really nice continuation of that low end into the guitars, and it just feels like one big monolithic, chunky sound. And that makes the guitars sound bigger. If you soloed them, they probably would sound very small. But in the context of everybody together, they feel very big. And that's a skill. That's harder to do than just turning things up. And I don't mean that to be derogatory towards the zero clipping style or whatever of mixing, but just suffice to say that that there may be other ways to achieve what that's trying to achieve that result in less harmonic distortion. And when you do it that way, you then preserve dynamics for dynamic effect. So if you really want to make something suddenly a little bit louder than it was before, you have the ability to go there. But once you go to like 0 and there's no more dynamic range in this, the song can't get any louder than that. So to me, that's like you're mixing yourself all the way into the corner before you even start. In my world, there's like a verse, a chorus, and second verse, second chorus. That. So if you're dealing in song structure, and you've maxed out the dynamic range in the first verse, I'm sorry, I'm just going to probably end up bored the third time you come around to the verse again. Like the third verse is going to be very boring because it's not going to be any louder or have developed anymore. So that, I guess that's what I'm.
I see what you mean. I mean, then if you just had a completely the same loudness through the whole song versus a song that started and then got a little bit louder, that song, it may not be actually loudness that you're going for, but rather impact that you're going for. And sometimes leaving yourself some headroom and then using the extra headroom strategically can lead to more impact. And if the person wants it to be louder overall, they've got a volume knob that they can turn up.
Yes.
It's louder. Yeah.
Yes. And that's the last part is the one that I think is the most important. It's like to remember, like you don't, if you mix loud, you make different decisions. You don't hear it the same way. Your hearing changes at loud levels. And I would worry about hearing damage, if you're not careful.
Yeah. I think like maybe part of the issue is a lot of people talk about louder and you want your mix to be as loud as possible. When I think that they're talking about perceived loudness, where it's like there might be better words to describe what we're going after. Because loud can just be louder, or it can mean thicker frequency distribution, or it can mean things, in the low end versus the mid range versus the highs, and how each of those differently affect perceived loudness. There's just more specific things you could drill down into.
Yeah. Well, it's like that famous saying, like, what weighs more, a ton of bricks or a ton of feathers?
Yeah.
The answer is they both weigh the same. They're both a ton. But when you think of a ton of bricks, you think of that as being somehow different than a ton of feathers. I mean, they take up different space, but they ultimately weigh the same.
Yep.
So if you threw a ton of, if the way I died on this earth is because I got crushed by a ton of feathers, that'd be a little harder to imagine than if I were walking down the street, got crushed by a ton of bricks. Like, okay, that makes more sense to me. And this is the thing, like measuring weight, just like measuring loudness is measuring loudness. But what we think about in terms of things that are heavy or light is what we know. And I think if I said distorted guitars, you'd think of that as loud. If I said acoustic guitars, you'd think of that as light. Right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that acoustic guitars can't be loud. Right? So you have to, it just requires a little bit more thinking. And I think experienced engineers, they get this sort of thing maybe a little more intuitively. No, you wouldn't want a ton of anything dropped on you, because that would be the end of you.
And this user is Aiden, by the way. So I think that it's landing. And so that he says, good. This is an interesting thing to think about. And I think it's landing, And Aiden, good. I mean, you're a member. So what I'd recommend is maybe take one of your mixes, put it in for a mix review, and then ask like, hey, I want it to sound this way. And one of the things you said, intentionally having the master clip only when the snare and kick bus sums with the instrumental. Like maybe the way to word that would be, hey, I've got this mix. I listened to this reference track, and leave us a link to that. And then we can listen to both of those things and say, hey, I noticed how the kick and the snare seem to distort and everything else doesn't pump with it. How do I get that effect?
Yeah.
And then we can maybe give you more detailed feedback.
If that's the case, then I think they're distorting the plugins and not the mixer, because you never want your tube bus to distort. You never want it to clip. It just is bad stuff.
I think that's especially relevant. Let's move on. But I think it's like, even if you want a sounds like it distorted the master, you probably want to have like a dB of just headroom above that, especially if you're going to put it on streaming services that may do some processing before, like I've heard that there's a potential for some lossy codecs to create additional distortion if there's absolutely no headroom left. in what their input is, right?
They'll also just turn it down. So as you're making it louder, they're also just making it quieter. So, you know, you're pushing on the pull door at some point.